The tea was still warm when they found it. February the 14th, 1934. A Tuesday morning at the British Museum. Ordinary in every way, except one. Margaret Ashworth's office door stood ajar, light spilling into the corridor, her coat draped over the chair as if she'd just stepped out for a moment. But Margaret Ashworth would never step anywhere again. The cup sat on her desk beside a small object wrapped in linen, the fabric peeled back to reveal what lay beneath. An Egyptian amulet, dark stone carved with symbols that predated Christ by 3,000 years. The tea's surface still rippled slightly from the vibrations of footsteps in the hallway. Her fountain pen lay uncapped. The ink hadn't dried. Margaret Ashworth had simply ceased to exist. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. There's a pattern written in the dust of museum archives and expedition journals, a thread connecting disappearances across decades. People who touched certain objects brought back from Egyptian tombs. People who vanished from locked rooms, from moving trains, from the middle of crowded streets. Expeditions that left England with 12 members and returned with 9. The missing never mentioned in official reports, their names scraped from photographs, erased from history as if they'd never drawn breath. What if some objects were never meant to leave their tomb? What if something followed them back? The question hangs in that cold office, in that cup of tea that no one would ever drink, beside that amulet that should have stayed buried in sand. The fog hung thick over Mayfair on the morning of March the 7th, 1922, when the housemaid Mary Thornton arrived at number 14 Belgrave Square with her usual bundle of cleaning supplies and a growing sense of unease. She had not seen her employer, Mr. Edmund Jeffries, in 3 days, which was unusual but not entirely unprecedented. The gentleman had become increasingly reclusive over the past several months, often refusing visitors and spending days locked away in his study. But what Mary discovered when she let herself in through the servant's entrance that morning would haunt her for the remainder of her life. The townhouse was empty, not merely vacant of people, but utterly devoid of everything. Every stick of furniture, every painting, every rug and curtain and lamp had vanished, as if they had never existed. The walls bore not even the faint rectangular shadows that usually mark where pictures once hung. The floors showed no indentations from heavy furniture that had stood in place for years. Mary would later tell police that she stood in the entrance hall for several minutes, unable to comprehend what her eyes were showing her. The sheer impossibility of it paralyzed her rational mind. She walked through room after empty room, her footsteps echoing in spaces that had been filled with the comfortable clutter of an educated gentleman's life just days before. Edmund Jeffries had been a man of modest fortune and immodest obsessions. As a distant cousin to the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, he had inherited just enough money to live comfortably without working, and just enough family connection to feel the sting of his own relative insignificance. While his famous relation financed the excavation of Pharaoh's tombs in the Valley of the Kings, Edmund collected Egyptian antiquities from the safer remove of London auction houses and the occasional dubious dealer. His friends, in the early days before they stopped calling, described him as harmless, if somewhat tiresome, the sort of amateur scholar who could corner you at a dinner party and lecture for an hour about funerary practices of the 18th dynasty. Everything changed in the autumn of 1921 when Edmund made a trip to Cairo. The details of this journey remain frustratingly vague. His passport showed entry into Egypt on September the 15th and departure on October the 3rd. He told his solicitor he was going to attend an auction of antiquities. He told his club he was meeting with scholars at the Egyptian Museum. He told his housekeeper he would return with treasures that would make his collection the envy of London. What is certain is that he returned with a single item, a canopic jar of unusual design and uncertain provenance. The jar itself was unremarkable to the casual observer. Roughly 14 inches tall, fashioned from pale limestone that had yellowed with age, it depicted the god Imsidi, guardian of the liver, with a human-headed stopper. Hieroglyphs ran in neat columns down its sides, though later examination by experts at the British Museum would reveal them to be a mixture of genuine Middle Kingdom script and later additions that made little grammatical sense. Edmund, however, treated this object with a reverence bordering on worship. He installed it in his study on a specially commissioned pedestal and spent hours each day sitting before it, sometimes reading aloud from his books on ancient Egyptian religion. sometimes simply staring at its painted face. The letters began in November. Edmund's correspondence had always been prolific. He wrote to fellow collectors, to museum curators, to anyone who might indulge his enthusiasm for Egyptology. But these new letters carried a different tone entirely. His handwriting, usually neat and precise, became increasingly erratic. To his friend Dr. Harold Wickham, he wrote that the jar spoke to him in the hours before dawn, not in words exactly, but in impressions and feelings that filled his mind like water filling a vessel. To his solicitor, he described voices that seemed to emanate from within the limestone, ancient voices speaking in a language he could not understand, but somehow felt he was beginning to comprehend. By December, the content of Edmund's letters had taken a darker turn. He wrote to his cousin's estate in Highclere, though Carnarvon himself was in Egypt and would never see the letter, describing how he had begun to notice figures watching his house. They stood across the street at dusk, he claimed, dressed in what he could only describe as ancient garb, though he struggled to articulate exactly what he meant. Long robes, perhaps, or wrapped cloth, faces that seemed both present and somehow not quite there. He admitted that when he looked directly at them, they seemed to fade. But in his peripheral vision, they remained solid and undeniably real. His housekeeper, Mrs. Florence Bartlett, later told investigators that she had noticed the change in her employer's demeanor. He stopped eating regular meals, surviving on tea and toast brought to his study. He rarely slept in his bedroom, instead dozing fitfully in a chair positioned to face the canopic jar. When she tried to dust the study, he became agitated, insisting that nothing in that room be touched or moved even a fraction of an inch. The jar, he told her, must remain exactly where it was. Its position had been carefully calculated according to principles he had read in ancient texts. To move it would be catastrophic, though he could not or would not explain what form this catastrophe might take. January brought the final series of letters, and these documents, preserved in the police files, make for deeply unsettling reading. Edmund wrote to the British Museum pleading for information about rituals of opening, claiming that he had found references in his books to ceremonies that might allow passage between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. He wrote to his bank with instructions to liquidate certain investments, though the money was never collected and the instructions were never completed. He wrote to Dr. Wickham one last time, a rambling 12-page letter that swung between lucid archaeological observations and paranoid ravings about watchers in the night, about whispers that grew louder, about a summons he felt compelled to answer. The last confirmed sighting of Edmund Jeffries was on March the 4th, 1922, when the postman delivered a package to Belgrave Square and saw the gentleman receiving it at the door. The postman later recalled that Mr. Jeffries appeared disheveled and distracted, accepting the package without his usual polite conversation. The package itself was never found among the evidence, and its contents remain unknown. 3 days later, Mary Thornton discovered the impossible emptiness. When Detective Inspector Thomas Radcliffe arrived at the scene, he initially suspected the housemaid of hysteria, or fabrication. Homes do not simply empty themselves of their contents. But as he walked through the echoing rooms, his skepticism gave way to a profound unease that he would describe in his official report with unusual candor. The house had not been burgled in any conventional sense. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks or shattered windows. The servant's entrance through which Mary had entered remained securely locked from the inside, as she had needed to use her key. The front door bore no scratches or damage to its substantial mechanism. More puzzling still was the sheer logistics of the disappearance. Edmund had owned hundreds of books, heavy furniture, including a mahogany desk that required 4 men to move, a pianoforte, cabinets filled with his collection of Egyptian artifacts, wardrobes stuffed with clothing, kitchen equipment, linens, personal effects accumulated over 43 years of life. To remove all of this would have required multiple wagons, many hours of labor, and the cooperation of servants and neighbors who swore they had seen and heard nothing unusual. The street outside showed no signs of heavy traffic, no gouges in the pavement from loaded carts, no reports from nearby residents of nighttime activity. The investigation expanded to Edmund's financial records, searching for a motive or explanation. Had he sold everything and fled to escape debts? But his accounts were in perfect order. showing a comfortable income from investments and no unusual withdrawals or payments. Had he planned an elaborate disappearance? But there were no tickets purchased, no forwarding addresses, no communication with shipping companies or storage facilities. Every avenue of inquiry led to a blank wall of impossibility. Yet in the center of the empty drawing room, placed with geometric precision on the bare wooden floor, sat the canopic jar. It remained when everything else had vanished, as if it were the still point around which reality had somehow rotated and emptied itself out. Detective Inspector Radcliffe stood over it for a long time, according to his notes, experiencing what he described as an irrational reluctance to touch it. When he finally did lift it to examine the base, he noted that it was lighter than expected, and that the stopper had been sealed with what appeared to be fresh wax. Though Edmund's own letters had mentioned opening and examining the jar's interior multiple times, the jar was catalogued as evidence and transported to the basement evidence room at Scotland Yard, assigned the reference number AJ-47-22. It sat among boxes of mundane criminal detritus, the physical remnants of solved and unsolved cases, waiting for a resolution that would never come. The investigation into Edmund Jeffries' disappearance gradually lost momentum. Without a body, without witnesses, without any physical evidence of foul play, there was simply nowhere for the inquiry to go. By summer, the case had been filed away, one more London mystery added to the growing collection. The fire started on November the 9th, 1922, in the early hours of the morning when the evidence room was unoccupied. The official investigation into the blaze determined that faulty electrical wiring was the likely cause. Though the building was less than 10 years old and the wiring had passed inspection only months before. What made the fire particularly devastating was its seemingly selective nature. It consumed completely the section of shelving where evidence box EJ-47-22 had been stored. Yet evidence stored just feet away remained largely untouched, singed, but intact. The fire brigade arrived quickly enough to prevent the blaze from spreading beyond the evidence room. But 3 constables who entered the room to fight the flames all reported the same strange phenomenon. They described a smell that did not match burning wood or paper, something ancient and spiced, like incense from a temple. They spoke of shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames, human-shaped forms that appeared to dance among the smoke. These observations were quietly removed from the official report, dismissed as the confused perceptions of men working in dangerous and disorienting conditions. When the debris was cleared and catalogued, no trace of the canopic jar was ever found. Not even fragments of limestone that might have survived the heat. It had vanished as completely as Edmund Jeffries himself, as completely as every possession he had owned. The case file, what remained of it after the fire, was eventually transferred to the closed archives, where it gathered dust alongside hundreds of other mysteries that London had swallowed and never given back. In the years that followed, there were occasional rumors. A dealer in antiquities claimed to have seen a jar matching its description at a private auction in Paris in 1925, though he could not recall who purchased it. A museum curator in Berlin reported acquiring a similar piece in 1928, but it was destroyed during the war. Some believe these were different objects entirely, that the original jar was consumed in the fire. Others suggest that certain artifacts carry with them a persistence that transcends normal physical laws, that they appear and disappear, according to logic we do not understand, and purposes we cannot fathom. The truth, like Edmund Jeffries himself, has passed beyond the reach of investigation, into that realm where facts fade and only questions remain, whispered in the darkness like voices from an ancient jar. The heat of the Egyptian summer pressed down on the 8 members of the Thompson expedition as they arrived at Amarna in late June of 1937. The ancient city, once home to the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, sprawled before them in dusty ruins, its secrets buried beneath centuries of sand and silence. Dr. Harold Thompson, a respected Egyptologist from Cambridge, had assembled what he considered the finest archaeological team of the decade. His journals from those first days brim with optimism and scholarly enthusiasm, describing the promising site of a small tomb complex on the eastern edge of the Royal Wadi. The team included Thompson himself, his assistant David Morrison, 2 excavation specialists named James Fletcher and Robert Chen, a linguistic expert called Margaret Winters, conservation specialist Elizabeth Hayes, a surveyor named Thomas Webb, and a photographer to document their findings. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary in those initial weeks. The expedition photographs from early July show the team posed beside their excavation site, 8 figures in colonial-era field clothes, squinting against the relentless sun. Yet, when you compare those images to photographs taken merely 2 weeks later, something shifts, something that defies easy explanation. By mid-July, they had broken through into a sealed chamber that had remained untouched for more than 3,000 years. The air that rushed out, Thompson wrote, smelled of eternity itself, a dry, papery scent that seemed to carry whispers from the age of pharaohs. Inside, contrary to their expectations of finding royal burial goods or religious artifacts, they discovered something far more intimate and unsettling. The chamber contained children's toys, small wooden animals with articulated limbs, spinning tops, a ball made of woven reeds, and dolls with painted faces worn smooth by ancient hands. These objects spoke of lives lived and lost, of childhood cut tragically short in an era when mortality claimed the young with cruel frequency. But it was the mirror that changed everything. Resting in a limestone niche, wrapped in deteriorating linen, they found an object of remarkable craftsmanship. The mirror measured roughly 8 inches in diameter, fashioned from polished obsidian that reflected images with startling clarity despite its volcanic origins. The volcanic glass had been worked to an almost impossible smoothness, its surface like frozen black water. On the reverse side, carved with meticulous precision, ran columns of hieroglyphs that Margaret Winters initially struggled to interpret. The symbols were archaic, predating even the Amarna period, suggesting the mirror itself might have been an heirloom, passed down through generations before finding its way into this sealed tomb of forgotten children. The hieroglyphs, when Winters finally translated them, offered no comfort. They spoke of seeing and being seen, of reflections that showed truth rather than mere appearance, of surfaces that revealed what should remain hidden. There were warnings too, fragmentary and difficult to parse, about the price of looking too deeply into the obsidian's dark face. Thompson dismissed these as typical ancient superstitions, the kind of mystical thinking that surrounded many ritual objects. He ordered the mirror carefully packed for transport back to England, where it could be studied properly under laboratory conditions. It was shortly after the mirror's discovery that the first journal entry appeared that makes no sense. On July 23, Thompson wrote about assigning tasks for the following day's excavation work. He listed 7 team members and their duties. 7, not 8. The omission seems like a simple clerical error, the kind of mistake anyone might make when exhausted by the desert heat and long hours of meticulous work. But then it happened again and again. Entries from late July and early August increasingly referred to 7 expedition members, though the author never comments on the discrepancy, never mentions that someone has left or fallen ill. David Morrison's diary tells a stranger story. On August 2nd, he wrote a lengthy passage describing a disagreement with someone he called SW about the proper method for photographing pottery fragments. He described this person's arguments in detail, noted their frustration with the limited lighting in the tomb complex, even mentioned lending them a spare notebook when their own had filled up. Yet nowhere in Morrison's diary does he write this person's full name. The initials, SWF, appear throughout his entries, always in context suggesting a fully present team member, someone Morrison interacted with daily. But Morrison never explains who SW is, as if the identity were so obvious it needed no clarification. The expedition photographs from August reveal the true depth of the mystery. In some images, 7 people pose for the camera. In others, taken on the same day according to the handwritten dates on the reverse, 8 figures appear. In one particularly disturbing sequence, 3 photographs were taken in rapid succession, all showing the team standing before the excavation entrance. The first shows 7 people. The second shows 8 toying die. The third shows 7 again, but the composition has shifted, people standing in different positions, as if someone had been removed, and the group unconsciously reorganized themselves to fill the gap. Among the expedition records preserved in the Cambridge University archives, there exists a personnel roster dated June 15, 1937, 2 weeks before the team departed for Egypt. Listed in neat typescript are 8 names, including one Sarah Whitmore, occupation listed as expedition photographer. Her qualifications included training at the Royal Photographic Society and previous experience on archaeological surveys in Greece and Palestine. Beside her name, someone had written in pencil a London address and a reference number for her employment contract. The document appears entirely legitimate, filed with other pre-expedition paperwork, stamped and signed by the university's administrative office. Yet in Thompson's final expedition report, submitted to the university in November of 1937, only 7 team members are listed. Sarah Whitmore's name appears nowhere in the official record. The budget accounting shows payment for 7 salaries, 7 return passages from Egypt, 7 sets of field equipment. When questioned years later about the expedition's roster, Thompson expressed confusion about the question. 8 members? No, certainly not. His team had numbered 7 from the start. He could name them all without hesitation, and he did, rattling off 7 names without pause or uncertainty. But Sarah Whitmore's handwriting appears throughout the expedition notes. A handwriting analysis conducted in the 1980s, during the first serious attempt to investigate the mystery, confirmed that numerous entries attributed to various team members were actually written by the same unidentified hand. This hand documented the discovery of the mirror, sketched the hieroglyphs, recorded measurements and observations. Marginal notes in this handwriting point out photographic opportunities, suggest angles and lighting arrangements. The writing is confident, professional, the hand of someone comfortable with technical documentation. The camera is perhaps the most chilling evidence. Among the expedition equipment returned to Cambridge, catalogued and stored in the university's basement archives, sat a Leica camera with its serial number, carefully logged in the inventory list. The notation beside it reads, Expedition Camera Secondary Unit. No one remembered packing this camera. No one could say who had used it. When the film inside was finally developed in 1979, more than 40 years after the expedition, it contained dozens of photographs. Most showed the expected scenes of archaeological work. Team members excavating, documenting finds, posing with artifacts. But interspersed throughout were self-portraits, dozens of them, showing a woman in her late 20s or early 30s. She wore the typical field clothing of the era, practical and somewhat masculine to modern eyes. Her hair was pulled back severely, her expression serious and professional. In some images, she photographed herself using the mirror technique, holding the camera at arm's length. In others, she appeared to have set up the camera on a tripod with a delayed shutter release, positioning herself within the frame of the tomb entrance or beside the excavation. In the background of these self-portraits, barely visible, other team members moved about their work. You could see Thompson examining pottery sherds, Morrison taking notes, Winters consulting her lexicons. None of them looked at the camera. None seemed aware that a photograph was being taken. It was as if the woman with the camera existed in a space adjacent to theirs, occupying the same physical location, but somehow separate, unnoticed, already fading from their collective memory even as the shutter clicked. The most disturbing photograph showed the entire team gathered around the obsidian mirror on the day of its discovery. 8 people crowded into the frame, their faces lit by the harsh light of handheld lamps, eyes reflecting white in the sudden flash. 7 of them looked at the camera, capturing that typical expression of people interrupted mid-task, slightly annoyed at the delay but willing to pose briefly. The 8th figure, the woman holding the cable release, smiled directly at the lens. Her image was slightly blurred, as if she had been moving, or as if the camera had somehow struggled to capture her properly. Upon the expedition's return to England in late September of 1937, no one mentioned Sarah Whitmore. Family members who welcomed the team home noted nothing unusual about their numbers. University colleagues who debriefed them about their findings never asked about a missing member. It was as if she had been systematically edited from collective memory, her presence extracted so cleanly that not even a sense of absence remained. The first hint that something was wrong came from an administrative clerk named Judith Marsh, who was processing the expedition's expense reports in December of 1937. She found inconsistencies in the numbers, requisitions for 8 sets of supplies, but reimbursement requests for 7. When she mentioned this to Thompson, he became agitated, insisting she had made an error. But Marsh was certain of what she had seen. She began digging through the files, finding more contradictions, more evidence of an 8th person who should have existed but somehow didn't. Marsh became obsessed with the mystery. She spent her evenings in the archives, comparing documents, making lists of discrepancies. She found the original personnel roster with Sarah Whitmore's name. She found supply requisitions mentioning 8 team members. She found a letter from the Royal Photographic Society confirming Sarah Whitmore's credentials and wishing her well on the expedition. But when Marsh tried to follow up, she hit walls of silence. The address listed for Sarah Whitmore in London did not exist. The reference number for her employment contract led nowhere. The Royal Photographic Society had no record of anyone by that name. In 1942, during the chaos of wartime London, Judith Marsh died in an air raid. Her personal papers, including her extensive notes on the Sarah Whitmore mystery, were lost in the same bombing. The case might have disappeared entirely if not for a brief article she had published in 1939 in an obscure journal of archival studies. The article, titled "The Problem of Documentary Inconsistency in Expedition Records," outlined the contradictions she had discovered without mentioning Sarah Whitmore by name. It concluded with an unsettling observation, that collective memory could be unreliable, that sometimes reality itself seemed to shift beneath the weight of investigation. Modern attempts to verify Sarah Whitmore's existence have yielded contradictory results. Birth records show a Sarah Whitmore born in 1903 in Yorkshire, matching the approximate age of the woman in the photographs. This Sarah Whitmore trained as a photographer and had the credentials listed in the expedition roster. But death records show this same Sarah Whitmore dying in 1936, a full year before the Thompson expedition departed for Egypt. The death certificate lists complications from influenza as the cause. She was buried in a churchyard in Yorkshire, where her gravestone can still be visited today. So who wrote those notes? Who took those photographs? Who appears in the images that should not exist? Some researchers have suggested elaborate hoaxes, though to what purpose remains unclear. Others point to the psychological effects of desert isolation, suggesting some form of shared delusion. But these explanations fail to account for the physical evidence, the handwriting, the photographs, the camera that no one remembered. The obsidian mirror itself disappeared sometime in the 1950s. University records show it being moved from one storage facility to another, the paper trail growing increasingly confused and contradictory. The last confirmed sighting was in 1953, when a graduate student mentioned seeing it in a basement archive. After that, nothing. Searches conducted in later decades found no trace of it. Like Sarah Whitmore herself, the mirror had been forgotten so completely that it was as if it had never existed at all. The ancient Egyptians understood something about death that we, in our modern world, have perhaps forgotten. They knew that the boundary between life and death was not a wall, but a membrane, thin, permeable, and far more dangerous than we might imagine. While most people are familiar with the Book of the Dead, that collection of spells and incantations meant to guide souls through the underworld, fewer know about its lesser-known companion text, the Book of Breathing. This collection of funerary papyri served a different, more unsettling purpose. It was designed not to guide the dead, but to sustain them, to quite literally ensure they could continue to breathe in the afterlife. The premise itself carries an uncomfortable weight. Breath is life. It is the most fundamental requirement of existence. We can survive weeks without food, days without water, but only minutes without air. The ancient Egyptian priests who composed these texts understood this primal truth, and they sought to extend this vital function beyond the grave. The spells contained within the Book of Breathing were meant to be recited over the deceased, to animate their lungs in the realm of the dead, to fill their bodies with the breath of eternity. But as scholars would eventually discover, some versions of these texts carried a warning that chills the blood. The reciprocal nature of these spells suggested that breathing life into the dead might require the living to surrender their own breath in exchange. The concept of magical reciprocity was not unknown in Egyptian funerary practice. The priests understood that all acts of magic demanded balance, that energy could not be created from nothing. To give life required taking it from somewhere else. Most versions of the Book of Breathing carefully structured their spells to draw this animating force from the natural world, from the wind, from the Nile, from the eternal cycles of nature itself. But certain versions, created for individuals of particular importance or particular desperation, went further. They created a direct link between the living and the dead, a connection that could sustain the deceased by drawing breath from those who performed the rituals, or from those who disturbed their rest. In 1913, the Berlin Egyptian Museum made what seemed at the time to be a routine acquisition. A papyrus fragment, unremarkable in appearance, was purchased from a dealer in Cairo, who claimed it had been recovered from a tomb complex in the Theban necropolis. The fragment was catalogued and filed away, one of thousands of ancient documents waiting for translation and study. It would not receive serious attention until several months later, when a young researcher noticed something peculiar about the hieroglyphs. They were inverted, written in reverse, as if reflected in a mirror. This fragment would eventually become known as the Berlin Reversal, and it would prove to be one of the most disturbing discoveries in Egyptology. The inversion of the text was not accidental, not a mistake made by an inexperienced scribe. It was deliberate, careful, executed with the precision that came only from deep knowledge and specific intent. Initial theories suggested it might be a protective spell against tomb robbers, a magical trap set to confuse those who would violate the sanctity of the burial. But as translation work progressed, a far more complex and troubling picture began to emerge. Dr. Heinrich Brugsch, a distinguished German Egyptologist already in his 70s when the fragment came to his attention, took on the challenging task of translation. Brugsch was no novice to ancient Egyptian magical texts. He had spent decades studying the religious and funerary literature of the pharaonic period. He had translated countless spells, incantations, and rituals, but the Berlin Reversal unsettled him in ways his colleagues found difficult to understand. His notes from the period reveal a growing obsession with the fragment and a deepening concern about its true purpose. The text itself, once properly deciphered despite its inverted form, appeared to be a variant of the Book of Breathing. But this version contained specific instructions that diverged from the known corpus. It spoke of objects, carefully prepared items that would be placed in the tomb alongside the deceased. These objects, according to the text, served as anchors. They were conduits, physical links between the realm of the dead and the world of the living. Through these anchors, the deceased could draw breath, could maintain their existence in the afterlife by tapping into the vital force of the living world. Brugsch's translation revealed a list, a catalog of these anchor objects. Certain amulets, prepared according to specific rituals. Canopic jars that had contained the organs of the deceased, but had been subjected to additional consecration rites. Small statues, ushapti figures, that had been created not as servants for the afterlife, but as vessels for this breathing spell. And the text made clear, in language that Brugsch found increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere superstition, that these objects should never be removed from their resting place. To take them was to establish a connection, to become part of the reciprocal exchange. In his final notes on the Berlin Reversal, written in the winter of 1914, Brugsch made a cryptic observation that his colleagues would puzzle over for years to come. He wrote that the spell did not curse those who entered tombs. Archaeologists and explorers could walk through burial chambers without fear. The magic was not designed to punish curiosity or scholarship. Instead, the curse, if it could be called that, activated only when the anchor objects were removed. Taking these specific items from their context, severing them from the body they were meant to sustain, created what Brugsch called a displaced reciprocity. The dead still needed breath, but now they would draw it from whoever possessed their anchors, whoever had disrupted the careful balance the priests had constructed. Brugsch died in 1915, and his work on the Berlin Reversal remained incomplete, his warnings largely unheeded. The fragment itself was eventually published in academic journals, but the peculiarities of its content were generally dismissed as examples of late-period magical thinking, the desperate attempts of a declining civilization to maintain its funerary traditions. The specific warnings about anchor objects were treated as curiosities, not legitimate concerns. But there was a pattern, one that took decades to notice because the events were separated by time and geography. A pattern of disappearances among those who had handled certain objects, objects that matched the descriptions in the Berlin Reversal. In 1923, a British collector who had acquired a set of unusually ornate canopic jars from a Theban tomb complex vanished from his London townhouse. The circumstances were bizarre. His servants reported that in the days before his disappearance, He had complained of difficulty breathing, of feeling as though the air in his rooms had grown thin, as though he were at a great altitude. The morning he vanished, his bedroom door was found locked from the inside, but the room was empty. The canopic jars were still there, arranged on his desk. In 1937, a French antiquities dealer suffered a similar fate after acquiring what he believed to be a rare Ushapti figure from a private collection. Witnesses described seeing him in a cafe in Paris, gasping for air, his face turning blue despite sitting in a well-ventilated space. He stumbled into the street and collapsed. By the time a doctor reached him, he had vanished entirely, leaving only his coat and hat on the pavement. The Ushapti was found in his apartment, and those who catalogued his estate noted that it matched the descriptions in Brugg's translation of the Berlin reversal. The pattern continued through the decades. A curator in Cairo in 1956, an archaeologist in Boston in 1972, a museum technician in Munich in 1989. Each had handled objects that corresponded to the anchor items described in the fragment. Each had reported respiratory difficulties before their disappearances, and each had vanished completely, leaving no trace, no body, no explanation. The disappearances were never officially connected because the victims were separated by years, by continents, by circumstances that seemed unrelated except for one thread. The objects they had possessed, objects that scholars eventually realized had all originated from the same tomb complex in Thebes, the very complex that had yielded the Berlin reversal fragment. The Berlin Egyptian Museum still holds the fragment in its collection. It has been extensively photographed, digitized, made available to researchers around the world. But the physical papyrus itself is rarely handled. There is no official policy against studying it, no curse warning attached to its catalog entry. Yet those who work in the Egyptian collection know its history, know the pattern of disappearances, and they choose to keep their distance. The inverted hieroglyphs remain as enigmatic as they were when Brugsch first attempted to decipher them, a warning written backward, perhaps so that it could be read correctly only by those already dead, already on the other side of that thin membrane between worlds. The question that haunts scholars who study the Berlin reversal is not whether the curse is real. That seems almost beside the point. The question is what the ancient priests truly believed they were creating when they crafted these reciprocal spells. Did they genuinely think they could sustain the dead by drawing from the living? And if so, what desperation drove them to create such connections, such dangerous links between the two realms? Perhaps they understood something about consciousness, about the nature of breath and life, that we have yet to rediscover. Or perhaps they were simply trying to hold on to their loved ones in the only way they knew how, by binding them to the world even after death. Consequences be damned. The Book of Breathing promised eternal existence, but it seems that eternity demands payment. And that payment, if Brugsch was right, if the pattern of disappearances means anything at all, is still being collected from those who disturb what should have remained at rest, from those who cannot resist taking what was never meant to leave the darkness of the tomb. The Metropolitan Museum of Art closes its doors to the public each evening at 5:30, and for most of the museum's history, that transition from public space to private workplace passed without incident. The guards would usher out the last lingering visitors, the lights would dim in the galleries, and the staff who worked the night shift would begin their quiet routines among some of civilization's greatest treasures. But in the winter and spring of 1952, something changed in those after-hours corridors, something that the institution would spend the next 7 decades trying to bury in bureaucratic silence. It began in January of that year, shortly after the museum accepted a substantial donation from the estate of Victor Horn, an Egyptologist who had died the previous autumn in circumstances that his own family described as unusual. Horn had spent 40 years amassing a private collection of Egyptian antiquities, and unlike many collectors of his era, he had kept meticulous records of each item's provenance and his own observations about them. His collection included the standard array of funerary objects, amulets, and fragments of temple decorations, but also stranger items that defied easy categorization. Small clay tablets covered in script that did not match any known Egyptian writing system. Mirrors made from polished obsidian that seemed to have been deliberately broken and then carefully reassembled. a series of wooden panels depicting figures that appeared human at first glance, but revealed disturbing anatomical impossibilities upon closer inspection. The museum's Egyptian department was thrilled with the acquisition. Here was a chance to study objects that had been locked away in private hands for decades, brought together by a scholar who, whatever his eccentricities, had genuine expertise. The items were cataloged and assigned to various staff members for cleaning, analysis, and preparation for potential display. What none of them knew was that they were about to become part of a mystery that would challenge everything the institution thought it understood about the boundaries between the seen and unseen world. Margaret Chen was the first to vanish. She was a conservation specialist in her early 30s, known among her colleagues for her steady hands and her ability to restore the most delicate artifacts. In late January of 1952, she was assigned to clean and assess a collection of small limestone fragments from the Horn donation, pieces that appeared to be from a dismantled shrine of some kind. Her co-workers noticed nothing unusual at first, but within a week of beginning her work on those fragments, subtle changes began to manifest. Robert Dalton, who shared a workspace with Margaret, later gave a statement to the museum's internal investigators that has never been made public, but was leaked decades later by a source within the institution's archive. In that statement, Dalton described how Margaret seemed to become somehow less present, even when she was standing right in front of him. He struggled to put the phenomenon into words. She was not invisible, he insisted. She was not fading like a ghost in some old story. Instead, it was as if she were becoming less important to the eye, less likely to draw attention. He found himself looking past her, forgetting she was in the room even while having conversations with her. Other colleagues reported similar experiences. Margaret would speak during meetings, and people would startle, suddenly remembering she was there. She would walk down hallways and guards, who had known her for years, would fail to acknowledge her, their eyes sliding over her, as if she were just another shadow on the wall. Margaret herself seemed unaware of the change, or at least she never mentioned it. She continued her work with the limestone fragments, growing more absorbed in them with each passing day. She began staying later, arriving earlier, spending hours alone with the objects in the conservation lab. On the evening of February 9th, 1952, she signed in for the night shift as usual. The security log shows her entering Conservation Lab 3 at 7:42 in the evening. She never signed out. She was never seen leaving. When morning staff arrived, the lab was empty. The limestone fragments she had been working on were arranged in a peculiar pattern on her workbench, positioned as if they were pieces of a puzzle she had been trying to solve. But Margaret Chen was gone. The museum's administration initially treated it as a missing persons case. They contacted the police, who conducted a standard investigation that went nowhere. Margaret had no history of mental illness, no financial troubles, no relationship problems that might explain a sudden disappearance. She had simply walked into a room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and ceased to exist in any findable way. Then it happened again. David Kowalski was a research assistant in the Egyptian department, a graduate student working on his dissertation about Middle Kingdom religious practices. He had been assigned to catalog a set of wooden staves from the Horn collection, ceremonial objects carved with repeated geometric patterns that seemed to shift slightly depending on the angle of viewing. Within 2 weeks of beginning his work, colleagues reported the same disturbing phenomenon. David was becoming translucent, not literally, but perceptually. He was there and not there, present but difficult to focus on, like a photograph slowly losing its contrast. His roommate, another museum employee named Thomas Garrett, described coming home to their shared apartment and repeatedly forgetting that David was in the room. He would walk in, put down his things, begin preparing dinner, and then suddenly notice David sitting at the kitchen table, even though David had been there the entire time. Garrett said it felt like his mind was refusing to acknowledge David's presence, editing him out of perception even as his physical form remained. On March 7, 1952, David Kowalski entered Storage Room 12 in the museum's basement level at approximately 8:15 in the evening. This time, there was security footage, grainy black and white film from a camera positioned to monitor the hallway. The footage shows David approaching the storage room door, unlocking it with his authorized key, and stepping inside. The camera had a clear view of the hallway, which was the only entrance and exit to Storage Room 12. David Kowalski was never seen emerging. When security staff opened the room the next morning, it was empty. The wooden staves he had been studying were found carefully arranged in a corner, standing upright as if positioned by deliberate hands. Now the museum administration began to panic. 2 disappearances could be coincidence. 3 would be a pattern. 4 would be a catastrophe. They initiated an internal investigation, bringing in security consultants and conducting interviews with every staff member who had contact with the Horn collection. What they discovered, according to leaked documents that surfaced decades later, was that the translucency effect had been observed in connection with at least 6 different staff members, all of whom had worked directly with items from Victor Horn's donation. 4 more individuals vanished between March and May of 1952. Susan Delacroix, an assistant curator. James Wu, a night security guard who had been assigned to watch over the storage areas containing the Horn items. Patricia Nolan, a photographer documenting the collection. And finally, in late May, Dr. Harold Eisenberg, a senior Egyptologist who had taken it upon himself to investigate the disappearances and had begun conducting his own private study of the Horn materials. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: the translucent period, lasting anywhere from 1 week to 3 weeks, during which the individual became progressively harder to notice, harder to remember, harder to perceive even when standing directly in view. Then, the final walk into a room from which they never emerged. Security footage, where it existed, showed them entering storage rooms, conservation labs, or archive spaces. The footage never showed them leaving. The rooms had no secret passages, no hidden exits, no windows large enough for a person to fit through. The individuals simply ceased to be. The museum's internal investigation produced a report that was immediately classified as confidential and locked away in the institution's private archives. The official position, communicated to the families and to the police, was that these were unrelated disappearances, possibly the work of someone who had found a way to evade the security systems, though no evidence of any such person was ever found. The museum hired additional security staff, changed their protocols for handling new acquisitions, and most significantly, made a decision that raised questions for anyone paying close attention. In late June of 1952, just weeks after the final disappearance, the Metropolitan Museum quietly deaccessioned the entire Victor Horn collection. Every single item he had donated was removed from the museum's holdings and sold to private buyers. The museum did not announce this publicly. There was no press release, no explanation offered to scholars who had been looking forward to studying the collection. The items were simply dispersed, scattered to private collectors whose identities were sealed under confidentiality agreements that remain in force to this day. Some of the buyers have been identified through decades of research by independent investigators. A shipping magnate in Oslo purchased several lots. A trust controlled by an old New England family acquired others. At least 3 items are believed to have ended up in the hands of a collector in Hong Kong, whose entire collection was later destroyed in a fire that investigators ruled as arson, though no suspect was ever charged. The majority of the Horn collection's final locations remain unknown, protected by legal barriers and institutional secrecy. The families of the vanished were left with nothing but questions and grief. Several attempted to sue the museum, but their cases were quietly settled out of court with agreements that included strict non-disclosure clauses. Others tried to access the museum's internal investigation files, only to be told that no such files existed or that they had been destroyed in accordance with records retention policies. The official position hardened over the years. The museum maintains to this day that the 1952 incidents were tragic but unrelated disappearances, and that any suggestion of a connection to the Horn collection is unfounded speculation. But the story refuses to die. In recent years, descendants of those who vanished have organized, pooling their resources to pressure the museum for transparency. They have filed freedom of information requests, hired lawyers, and brought media attention to bear on an institution that prizes its reputation above almost all else. They want access to the security footage, to the internal investigation reports, to any documentation that might explain what happened to their grandparents and great-grandparents in those terrible months of 1952. The museum has resisted every attempt citing privacy concerns, institutional policy, and the supposed non-existence of relevant documents. But in 2019, a breakthrough occurred. A former archivist, retired and freed from confidentiality obligations, came forward with copies of witness statements from the internal investigation. These documents, now circulating among researchers and family members, paint a picture far stranger than simple disappearances. They describe staff members who saw their colleagues becoming transparent in more than just the perceptual sense. There are accounts of individuals appearing to flicker, to exist incompletely, as if they were present in the room but simultaneously somewhere else. There are descriptions of voices that seem to come from great distances, even though the speaker was standing close by. And most disturbing, there are reports from the final days before each disappearance of the affected individuals, speaking about seeing other places overlaid on the museum's architecture, describing vast empty spaces and distant lights that no one else could perceive. Whatever happened in the Metropolitan Museum of Art during those months in 1952, it was not something that fit within conventional explanations. The institution responded not with transparency but with suppression, choosing to protect its reputation rather than confront the inexplicable. And now, more than 70 years later, the truth remains locked behind sealed files and scattered across a collection that was deliberately dispersed to prevent anyone from ever assembling the full picture again. The descendants continue their fight for answers, knowing they may never find them, knowing that the bureaucratic walls built around this mystery may be impenetrable. But they persist because the vanished deserve to be remembered, deserve to be more than bureaucratic footnotes, deserve to be acknowledged as people who walked into rooms in one of the world's great museums and never came home. In the scorching summer of 1928, a team of French archaeologists working in the forgotten valleys west of Luxor stumbled upon something that would challenge everything Egyptologists thought they understood about the ancient Egyptian afterlife. The excavation had begun with modest expectations, another survey of minor provincial sites. What they unearthed instead was a temple complex that had been deliberately buried under tons of sand and rubble, sealed away as if those who closed it never wanted it reopened. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Henri Beaumont, documented his first descent into the main sanctuary with an unusual degree of personal commentary. He wrote that the air inside felt wrong, somehow thick despite having been sealed for millennia. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with inscriptions, but these weren't the familiar funerary texts or hymns to the sun god. These detailed something darker, a practice that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of Egyptian religion. The temple was dedicated to Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague, but not in her common aspects as protector or healer. Here, she was venerated as the devourer of shadows, a title that appeared nowhere else in the Egyptian religious canon. The inscriptions described her as the keeper of souls that belonged to neither the living world nor the field of reeds. She was, according to these texts, the mistress of those who exist in the spaces between, trapped in eternal service. What made Beaumont and his team deeply uncomfortable was the explicit, almost instructional nature of the temple writings. These weren't metaphorical or poetic. They read like manuals, step-by-step guides for a ritual that the text called the binding of Ka-Dawah. The ancient Egyptian concept of the Ka, the vital essence or life force of a person, was well understood by scholars. But this temple proposed something that contradicted the entire foundation of Egyptian afterlife beliefs. Instead of allowing the Ka to journey to the afterlife, these rituals described how to trap it, to bind it permanently to a physical object in the world of the living. The inscriptions detailed the selection process first. The chosen individuals were not criminals or enemies, but rather people of particular skills. Artisans, scribes, musicians, those whose abilities would be valuable for eternity. The text suggested that someone willingly promised a form of immortality. Others were taken through deception or force. The ritual required specific timing, certain alignments of stars visible only during particular seasons. The person would be brought before the sanctuary of Sekhmet in her shadow aspect, their Ka called forth through incantations that filled 17 columns of hieroglyphic text on the temple's northern wall. Then came the binding itself. The Ka would be forced into a prepared object, what the texts call a vessel of containment. These weren't random items but carefully crafted artifacts designed specifically for soul imprisonment. The inscriptions described 3 primary types in exhaustive detail. first were mirrors, but not ordinary reflecting surfaces. These were made from specific bronze alloys mixed with meteoric iron, polished to perfect smoothness, and inscribed on the reverse with protective spells twisted into binding curses. The texts claimed that souls trapped in mirrors could see out, could watch the world of the living pass by, but could never interact, never escape, never die. The second type involved jewelry, particularly items worn close to the heart or throat. Pectorals, broad collars, certain amulets of unusual design. The temple walls showed drawings of these pieces, each incorporating a scarab beetle carved from black stone, its underside hollowed out in a way that served no decorative purpose. The ritual descriptions explained that the hollow would be filled with a paste containing the blood of the victim mixed with powdered lapis lazuli and spoken over with the binding words. Once sealed and placed on the victim during the ritual's climax, the ka would be drawn into the scarab, compressed into that tiny hollow space for all eternity. The third category was the most disturbing. Sealed vessels, specifically canopic jars of a particular design that inverted the traditional purpose of these objects. Normal canopic jars held the preserved organs of the deceased for their use in the afterlife. These vessels were designed to hold something that could not decay, could not escape. The lids were carved with the head of Sekhmet rather than the traditional four sons of Horus, and the interior was covered with spiraling text that the excavation team's translator said repeated a single phrase thousands of times. The phrase translated roughly as "that which enters shall not depart. That which is contained knows neither death nor rebirth." The temple contained a chamber that Beaumont described as a storage room, though calling it that seems inadequate for what it represented. Shelf after shelf carved into the rock walls, hundreds of niches, most of them empty. But not all. The team found 23 artifacts still in place. 9 mirrors of the described design, 7 pieces of jewelry matching the ritual specifications, and 7 sealed vessels. Beaumont wanted to open one of the vessels. His colleagues refused. The argument grew heated enough that it appears repeatedly in multiple expedition journals. In the end, nothing was opened. Everything was documented, photographed, and shipped to the Musée du Louvre in Paris. Here's where the academic world made a critical decision that would echo for decades. The findings were published, but with an interpretive framework that rendered them safe, digestible, metaphorical. Leading Egyptologists of the 1930s declared that the Temple of the Devourer of Shadows represented an outlier cult, perhaps a group that had broken away from mainstream religious practices. The binding rituals were symbolic, they said, representing philosophical concepts about memory and legacy, rather than literal soul imprisonment. The artifacts were simply unusual, devotional objects. The academic consensus formed quickly and solidly. To suggest otherwise was to invite professional ridicule. The artifacts went into storage, carefully cataloged but rarely studied. The temple site was backfilled and lost again to the desert, its exact location becoming unclear as Beaumont's expedition notes proved frustratingly vague about the GPS coordinates that wouldn't exist for another 50 years. For decades, the Temple of the Devourer of Shadows remained a footnote, a curiosity mentioned briefly in comprehensive surveys of Egyptian religion. But something began happening in the late 1990s and early 2000s that made a few scholars take a second look. A pattern emerged, invisible at first because it crossed disciplinary boundaries between archaeology, museum studies, and criminal investigation. People who handled certain artifacts, specifically artifacts matching the temple descriptions, began to disappear. The cases shared eerie similarities. In 2003, a museum conservator in Berlin vanished after spending a weekend cleaning and documenting a bronze mirror that had been in storage since its acquisition in 1931. The mirror matched the temple specifications exactly, though it had been found in a completely different site and was not part of Beaumont's original discovery. Colleagues reported that she had become obsessed with the object, insisting she could see movement in its reflection when no one was there. Her apartment was found undisturbed, all her belongings in place, but she was gone. The mirror was returned to storage. It disappeared from the museum's collection 3 months later under circumstances never explained. In 2007, an antiques dealer in London who specialized in Egyptian jewelry went missing. His last known activity was cataloging a pectoral piece featuring a black scarab with an unusually deep hollow on its reverse. Friends said he'd been having nightmares about drowning in darkness, about being compressed into impossibly small spaces. The pectoral was never recovered. His body was never found. A graduate student in Cairo disappeared in 2012 while researching canopic jars for her dissertation. Her research focused on unusual variations in jar design, and her notes indicated she had located a sealed vessel matching the temple descriptions in a private collection. She had arranged to examine it. The last entry in her research journal, written the morning of her disappearance, noted that she had successfully negotiated permission to open the jar and analyze its contents. The jar's owner claimed she never arrived for the appointment. The jar itself could not be located afterward, the owner suddenly vague about its whereabouts, eventually claiming it had been sold to an unnamed buyer. These cases, and 17 others like them, caught the attention of Dr. Sarah Chen, an Egyptologist at Cambridge who had developed an interest in what she called archaeological cold cases. In 2018, she published a preliminary paper that did something academics rarely do. She connected dots that crossed between ancient history and contemporary missing persons investigation. She laid out the pattern: artifacts matching temple specifications, handlers who became obsessed or disturbed, sudden disappearances leaving no trace, and the subsequent vanishing of the artifacts themselves. Chen went further. She re-examined Beaumont's original translations, consulting with specialists in archaic Egyptian dialects. She argued that previous scholars had been too eager to interpret the texts as symbolic because the alternative was too disturbing to accept. The rituals, she proposed, were meant to be taken literally. The ancient cult believed they were actually trapping souls, and the specificity of the instructions suggested they had refined the practice over considerable time. Other researchers began taking second looks at their own material. A curator at the Louvre examined the original artifacts from Beaumont's expedition, still sealed in storage after 90 years. She reported feeling an intense compulsion to open one of the sealed vessels, a desire she described as completely uncharacteristic and deeply unsettling. She requested transfer to a different department. When asked directly what she felt when handling the objects, she said only that they felt occupied, a word she couldn't better explain. The question that haunts modern investigators is whether the ancient rituals actually worked. Not in some supernatural sense necessarily, though that possibility can't be entirely dismissed, but whether these objects, through their design, their cultural weight, their history, have gained a kind of psychological gravity that affects those who handle them, or whether something else is at work, something the ancient Egyptians understood that modern science has yet to rediscover. The Temple of the Devourer of Shadows remains lost in the Egyptian desert. The artifacts scattered across museums and private collections continue their strange association with disappearances. And somewhere, if the ancient texts are to be believed, souls trapped between life and death wait in eternal service to a goddess whose very name has been almost forgotten by history. The security footage is still stored in Oxford's archive, locked away from public view, but those who have seen it say the same thing. There's nothing unusual about it. Nothing, that is, except what it doesn't show. On the night of November 15, 1963, Margaret Ashford entered the restricted archive of the Ashmolean Museum at exactly 11:47 in the evening. The cameras captured her clearly. She wore her characteristic wool cardigan, the dark blue one her colleagues all recognized, and she carried a leather portfolio under her left arm. Her right hand held her security badge, which she'd used to unlock the archive door. The footage shows her pausing in the doorway just for a moment, turning her head as if listening to something. Then she stepped inside, and the heavy door closed behind her with the pneumatic hiss these old systems always made. She never came out. The archive had one entrance, one door. The room itself was a converted strongroom from the museum's original 1845 construction, built into the foundation with walls 3 feet thick. No windows. No vents large enough for anything but air. The security camera covered the entire corridor leading to that door, positioned so that nothing could approach or leave without being recorded. The system was state-of-the-art for 1963, installed just 8 months earlier after a series of thefts at Cambridge had prompted museums across Britain to upgrade their security measures. The footage ran continuously. No gaps, no malfunctions. The timestamps marched forward in their inexorable progression, minute by minute, and the corridor remained empty. At 12:15 a janitor passed by, pushing his cart. At 12:42, the night guard made his rounds, checking the door and finding it properly secured. At 1:03, he returned, walking the corridor again. The camera recorded it all in grainy, black and white, the images slightly degraded but perfectly clear on the essential point. Nobody entered or left that archive except Dr. Margaret Ashford, and she only entered. When the guard returned at 1:15 and found the door still locked from the inside, he initially felt no alarm. Dr. Ashford often worked late. She was known for losing track of time when she was absorbed in her research, but museum policy required all personnel to exit the restricted areas by 1 in the morning, no exceptions, and the guard knew that Dr. Ashford, whatever her scholarly passions, was meticulous about following regulations. He knocked. No response. He knocked again, louder, calling her name. The corridor carried sound well. Those thick walls created strange acoustics, bouncing voices in unexpected ways. But no answer came. He used his master key. The lock turned smoothly, the mechanism well maintained, and he pushed the door open. The archive was empty. Dr. Margaret Ashford was gone. The guard searched the room thoroughly, though there was precious little to search. The archive was not large, perhaps 20 feet by 30, with steel shelving units bolted to the walls and a single examination table in the center. Track lighting illuminated every corner. There was nowhere to hide, no closets or alcoves, no furniture substantial enough to conceal a person. The shelving held artifacts in careful arrangement, each piece logged and positioned according to the museum's cataloging system. Nothing appeared disturbed, except for the examination table. On its surface lay a sistrum, a ceremonial rattle from ancient Egypt. The object had arrived at the museum 6 weeks earlier as part of a private donation from the estate of Colonel Richard Pemberton, a career military man who spent 20 years stationed in Cairo during the British occupation. The donation included 17 pieces, most of them unremarkable examples of common antiquities, the sort of items that enthusiastic but untrained collectors accumulated. This sistrum, however, had caught Dr. Ashford's attention immediately. It was bronze, corroded green with age, shaped in the traditional form. A handle supporting a U-shaped frame strung with metal rods that would create a rattling sound when shaken. Such instruments were used in worship ceremonies dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of music and joy. Thousands of sistrums survived from ancient Egypt. They were not rare, but this one was covered in inscriptions that Dr. Ashford couldn't immediately identify. She'd made note of this in her initial assessment, commenting that the hieroglyphs seemed irregular, possibly a provincial variation, or perhaps the work of a scribe unfamiliar with standard form. She'd requested time to examine it more closely, to photograph the inscriptions and attempt a proper translation. The examination had been scheduled for that night, November 15th, when she could work without interruption. The sistrum lay on the examination table, positioned precisely in the center, and according to every witness who entered that archive in the hours that followed, it was moving. Not shaking violently, not clattering with obvious motion, just vibrating, barely perceptibly, producing a sound that the first guard described in his written statement as being like someone breathing in reverse. A soft, rhythmic disturbance of the air, an inhalation that went on too long, pulling sound inward rather than expelling it outward. Next to the sistrum, Dr. Ashford's notes. She'd been writing in her usual manner, using her favorite fountain pen, a Parker Duofold she'd owned since her university days. Her handwriting was distinctive, precise without being rigid, slightly right-slanting, with characteristic flourishes on her capital letters. Colleagues who knew her work could identify her hand immediately. The notes began normally. She'd documented the sistrum's measurements, describing its physical condition, noting areas of particular corrosion and places where the bronze retained traces of its original luster. She'd sketched the overall form, adding dimensional annotations. Then she'd begun transcribing the inscriptions, working methodically from the handle upward. The notes covered 3 pages. On the 3rd page, midway down, the handwriting changed. Not gradually. Not with the subtle shift that might occur when someone's hand grew tired or their concentration wavered. The change was absolute, occurring mid-word. The letters became angular, harder, pressed into the paper with greater force. The slant reversed. leaning sharply left, and the language ceased to be English. The final 7 lines were written in Middle Egyptian, the language of the Empire period, using hieratic script. This wasn't the formal hieroglyphic writing used for monuments and religious texts. This was the cursive form, the everyday hand that scribes employed for administrative documents and personal correspondence. Someone had written these lines quickly, with the fluency of a native hand, each character formed with the unconscious ease that comes only from lifelong familiarity. Dr. Ashford did not write hieratic script. She could read it, slowly, with reference materials at hand. She was a specialist in Egyptian antiquities, yes, but her expertise lay in analysis and interpretation, not in production. No scholar in 1963 could write hieratic with such fluency. The last native scribes had died more than 1,500 years ago. The pen still rested on the page, touching the paper where the final character ended, incomplete. The ink was wet. When the guard first saw it, a small pool of blue-black ink was spreading slowly from the pen's nib, soaking into the fiber, creating a dark star-shaped stain. Dr. Ashford's cardigan lay folded on a chair near the examination table. Her shoes were placed neatly beneath the chair, side by side, aligned parallel. Her portfolio rested against the chair's leg. Everything suggested someone who intended to return, who had simply stepped away for a moment. But the security footage confirmed the impossibility. She had not left. The museum's administration called the police at 2:30 in the morning. By dawn, the archive had been thoroughly examined by detectives, by the museum's director, by Dr. Ashford's colleagues from the Egyptian Antiquities Department. Everyone confirmed the same impossible facts. One door. Continuous surveillance. No exit. No Margaret Ashford. The hieratic script was photographed and sent to specialists. The translation came back within a week, and the museum's administration immediately suppressed it. According to sources who saw the translation before it was sealed, the text was a first-person account, written in the voice of someone describing their own arrival. The pronoun forms were feminine. The writer referred to being called, to answering, to crossing through a doorway that existed in sound rather than space. The final line, the incomplete character, appeared to be the beginning of a phrase meaning to become or to transform. Theories emerged, of course. They always do when rational explanation fails. Some suggested that Dr. Ashford had suffered a mental breakdown, that she'd somehow evaded the cameras through a technical glitch not yet discovered. But the footage had been examined frame by frame. Modern analysis using digital enhancement techniques unavailable in 1963 has confirmed there were no gaps, no anomalies, no moments where the recording failed. Wanting to honest video. Others proposed elaborate hoaxes, though no motive was ever established. Dr. Ashford was well respected, financially secure, happily immersed in her work. Her personal life was stable. She had no debts, no scandals, no reason to orchestrate a disappearance, and even if she'd wanted to vanish, the physical impossibility remained. The archive had one door. The camera never stopped recording. She did not leave. The sistrum was examined by multiple experts. The inscriptions were documented, though no consensus was ever reached about their origin or meaning. Some scholars insisted they were genuine ancient Egyptian religious texts. Others claimed they were modern forgeries, though they couldn't explain how they'd been produced or why. The bronze itself defied precise dating. Carbon testing was useless on metal, and the style could have placed the object anywhere within a 1,000-year span of Egyptian history. What disturbed the examiners most was the sistrum's acoustic properties. When shaken under controlled conditions, it produced the expected rattling sound, the clatter of bronze rods against the metal frame. But when left motionless on a stable surface, away from vibration or air currents, it would occasionally begin that subtle movement the guards had described, the breathing sound. Several researchers reported hearing it, always at night, always when they were alone with the object. Recording equipment picked up the vibration but rendered it as simple white noise, masking any pattern that human ears detected. The museum's administration made a decision. On January 3, 1964, the archive was officially sealed. The sistrum was locked inside, along with Dr. Ashford's notes, her cardigan, her shoes, her portfolio. Everything remained exactly as it had been found. The door was locked. the handle wrapped with chains and secured with the museum's largest padlock. A new storage system was implemented, and the restricted materials were relocated to a different facility. The archive has remained sealed for 60 years. Museum staff avoid that corridor when possible. The security camera still operates, still recording the empty hallway, the chained door, though now the footage is digital, stored on servers rather than magnetic tape. But on November 15th each year, the guards report hearing sounds from behind that door. The soft rattle of bronze on bronze. The rhythm of breathing that pulls inward instead of pushing out. Some years it lasts only a few minutes. Other years, it continues until dawn. No one has proposed opening the archive. Whatever happened to Dr. Margaret Ashford, whatever she found or became in those silent hours between her entrance and her impossibility, the museum's administration has decided it should remain undisturbed. The archive is listed in internal documents as permanently sealed pending further research, though no research is planned and none will be permitted. The security footage from that night exists in the museum's records, labeled and indexed. Occasionally, researchers request access, hoping to find some overlooked detail that might explain the disappearance. The museum always denies these requests. Those who've seen the footage say there's nothing to find, nothing except Margaret Ashford entering a room and never leaving, the camera watching an empty corridor where the impossible occurred and the rational world simply stopped making sense. The last sound anyone heard from her was the soft click of the archive door closing, captured on the audio track of that security recording. A pneumatic hiss and a lock engaging, sealing her inside a room from which there was no exit and into which perhaps she never truly arrived at all. The question that keeps investigators awake at night is deceptively simple, yet impossibly complex. Why does the curse choose some people and completely ignore others? The pattern defies every logical explanation. Two researchers can handle the same artifact on the same afternoon in the same room. One walks away unscathed, continues their career, grows old, surrounded by grandchildren. The other simply vanishes within weeks, leaving behind only unanswered phones and abandoned apartments. The selection process appears almost deliberate, as if the objects themselves possess agency, preference, intention. Thousands of Egyptian artifacts continue circulating through the world right now. Their precise locations unknown after decades of private sales and estate dispersals. Many passed through the hands of collectors who never cataloged them properly, never documented their origins. When these individuals died, their heirs sold entire collections to dealers who sold to other dealers who sold to anonymous buyers. The chain of custody dissolves into shadows. These objects exist somewhere in penthouses, in climate-controlled basements, in safety deposit boxes, in storage units across every continent. We have no idea which ones might carry whatever force claimed those who came before. Perhaps most disturbing is what we have found, or rather, what we have never found. Not a single body. Not one piece of evidence suggesting foul play. Just people who stop answering their doors, stop appearing at their jobs, stop existing in any traceable way. Yet the disappearances cluster around specific categories of relics with mathematical precision that demolishes any possibility of coincidence. What few people realize is that major museums maintain secret lists, protocols never mentioned in public tours or educational materials. Certain objects will not be displayed under any circumstances. Researchers requesting access face extreme restrictions, multiple approval layers, mandatory observers, time limits measured in minutes rather than hours. These institutions will never formally acknowledge what they suspect, what they fear. But the lists exist, locked in administrative offices, updated whenever another object exhibits the wrong kind of history. And here is the truly haunting reality. Hundreds of thousands of Egyptian artifacts remain in private collections worldwide, their histories incomplete, their effects unknown, their futures uncertain. The curse, if we dare call it that, remains in circulation, waiting in the dark. In 2019, a storage locker in New Jersey went to auction after years of unpaid rent. The winning bidder paid $400 for the contents. Inside sat a sealed wooden crate marked with Metropolitan Museum catalog numbers from 1952. The auction winner never came to claim their purchase. When the facility manager checked the locker 1 week later, the crate stood open and completely empty. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.